My name is Marcus Webb, and this is the account of what happened to me in the Kootznoowoo wilderness of southeast Alaska during the autumn of 2019. I am writing this now, 3 years later, because I believe people need to know the truth about what exists in the remote forests of this continent. Not myth, not legend, real threats that are far worse than any folklore. I was 38 years old when I took the ranger position at the remote station. I had been working in wildlife management for 12 years, but I had an obsession that my colleagues found embarrassing. I believed that Bigfoot was real, and I intended to find evidence of it. The scientific community had largely dismissed Bigfoot as folklore, a mixture of misidentified bears and wishful thinking. But I had read too much, studied too many credible witness accounts, analyzed too many footprint casts and hair samples. The evidence, when you examined it seriously, suggested something real. Not a myth, not a monster, but a large, undocumented primate species that had managed to avoid scientific confirmation through intelligence and extreme caution. The Kootznoowoo position was perfect for my purposes. The wilderness area covered approximately 700 square miles of old-growth forest, largely untouched by human development. It was remote enough that I could spend long periods in the field without interference, and it was the right habitat, dense forest, abundant food sources, isolation. If Bigfoot existed anywhere in North America, it would be in places like this. I arrived in September and immediately began planning my research. I was officially conducting wildlife surveys for the Ranger Service, which was true. But my primary focus was finding evidence of undocumented primate activity. I set up trail cameras in strategic locations. I began systematic surveys of the deeper wilderness areas. I collected and cataloged hair samples, scat samples, and documented unusual animal tracks. The first month was uneventful. I found large five-toed tracks on a few occasions, but they were probably from bears. I collected hair samples from the wire I strung across potential pathways, but nothing unusual. The expected wildlife appeared: black bears, deer, the occasional moose. The landscape was beautiful but ordinary. Then, in early November, I found something that changed everything. I was in the southeastern section of my patrol area, about 7 miles from the cabin, when I came across footprints in the mud beside a creek bed. The tracks were unmistakable, bipedal, much larger than a human foot, with a distinctive mid-tarsal break the hallmark of a real primate footprint, not a hoax or a bear track. I documented everything: photographs from multiple angles, plaster casts, measurements. The footprints measured approximately 15 inches long, which would correspond to a creature standing around 7 feet tall and weighing perhaps 400 to 500 pounds. The stride length was consistent with what researchers had documented for Bigfoot, much longer than a human's would be, suggesting a different biomechanics, a different way of moving through the world. I was exhilarated. This was real. The evidence was real. I had physical proof that something was here. But I also had a problem. I was alone. Without a team, without other witnesses, the evidence would be dismissed as hoax or misidentification by the scientific community. I needed more. I needed video footage, or better yet, I needed to actually see the creature. But I also knew that would be difficult. These animals, if they existed, were extremely shy and elusive. They had survived this long by avoiding human contact. I decided to change my approach. Instead of passive observation, I would use active hunting techniques, not to harm the animal, but to locate it. I would use calls and sounds to potentially attract the creature's attention. I would position myself strategically and wait. This would require extended periods in the wilderness, away from the relative safety of the cabin. I began spending more time in the field. 4 days, 5 days, sometimes a full week at a time in the deeper wilderness. I brought camping equipment, food, water purification tablets, first aid supplies. I kept detailed logs of everything I observed. And then, in mid-November, I heard something that made my blood run cold. I was approximately 10 miles from the cabin, in a remote valley where I had found the large footprints, when I heard a vocalization that I had never heard before. It was deep, resonant, something between a roar and a howl, but fundamentally different from anything in the known fauna. It came from perhaps a mile away, echoing through the forest in a way that made it impossible to determine the exact direction. I stood absolutely still for nearly 5 minutes, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I was holding my recording device, a professional quality audio recorder that I had brought specifically for documenting unusual sounds. I had switched it on immediately when I heard the vocalization, and I had captured the sound. When I reviewed the audio later, back at the cabin, the sound was unmistakable. It was not a known animal. It was not any creature in the documented fauna of Alaska, and it was approximately the size and tone that researchers theorized a large primate would produce. I had been documenting the evidence for weeks. Now I had audio. Real audio, professionally recorded, of a vocalization that could not be easily dismissed. I should have reported this to the Ranger Service. I should have brought in a team of researchers. I should have followed proper protocols. Instead, I became obsessed. I spent more and more time in the field, venturing farther from the cabin, pushing into areas of the wilderness that had very few human visitors. I was looking for the creature. I was convinced that I could find it, that I could be the person who finally provided irrefutable evidence of Bigfoot's existence. This obsession would nearly cost me my life. It was mid-December when I first encountered the person I would come to know as the Skinwalker. I was camped in a small clearing about 12 miles from the cabin, in an area I called the North Ravine. It was a good location for observation, a natural trail that animals used when moving through the forest, good sight lines in multiple directions, a water source nearby. I had been there for 5 days, surviving on camping, food, and water from the creek. I was sitting by my small camp stove on the evening of the 5th day when I heard something moving through the forest. It was coming from the west, moving directly toward my camp. The movement was deliberate and quiet, not the crashing passage of a large animal, but the careful, methodical advance of something intelligent. I killed my stove light immediately and waited in darkness. My hand went to the pistol on my hip, a precaution I had started carrying after spending so much time in the wilderness. It was a .357 Magnum, which in theory could stop a large bear, though I had never wanted to test that theory. The figure emerged from the darkness about 30 feet from my camp. It was a man. At first, I thought he was another ranger or possibly a lost hiker. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness and my night vision improved, I realized something was wrong. The man was incredibly thin, almost skeletal. His clothes were torn and filthy, hanging off him in tatters. His hair was long and matted, and he was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You're in my territory," the man said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. "You need to leave." "I'm a federal ranger," I said, trying to sound confident. "I have authorization to be here. Who are you?" The man smiled, and the expression was deeply wrong. His teeth were in poor condition, blackened in places, and the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm the one who watches this place. I'm the one who knows what lives here, and you're bringing attention to things that should stay hidden." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "But you need to identify yourself. Are you lost? Do you need help?" "Help?" The man laughed. "No one can help me. I'm cursed. The Skinwalker marked me, and now I'm marked too. But I've learned to live with it, and I keep it contained. Keep it away from people who don't understand." This was the moment I should have realized I was dealing with a mentally ill person. But in the moment, the combination of his intense demeanor and my own obsession with finding evidence of unusual creatures in this forest led me in a different direction. "What do you mean, Skinwalker?" I asked. "There's no such thing as skinwalkers. That's Navajo folklore." "You think you're here looking for Bigfoot," the man said, moving slightly closer. You think you're a scientist. You think you can find something and report it and be famous. But you don't understand what's actually in these woods. The thing you're looking for isn't a regular animal, it's something else. And there are people or things pretending to be people that protect it, that hunt anyone who gets too close. I was increasingly convinced I was dealing with someone who was delusional or experiencing a mental health crisis. Listen, I said as calmly as I could. My name is Marcus. I'm a federal ranger. There's a cabin about 12 miles south of here. You need medical attention. I can help you get back. My name is David, the man said. David Orinoco. And I've been living in this forest for 4 years, ever since I saw it, ever since I understood what was here. Okay, David, I said, using his name in an attempt to establish rapport. What did you see? David sat down slowly, about 10 feet from me, still maintaining that unsettling stare. I came here as a researcher, he said, same as you. I was studying bear behavior for a university. I thought I was intelligent. I thought I could be objective, but then I saw it. A man walking through the forest at night, but his movements were wrong. His proportions were wrong. The way he moved his head, the way his joints bent all wrong, like something wearing a human suit that didn't quite fit. Despite my skepticism, I was listening intently. Did you get a photo? Any evidence? Evidence? David laughed bitterly. Of course not, because if you see what I saw, you understand immediately that you need to keep quiet. Because the next time I was in the forest, the thing found me. It hunted me. It chased me for 3 days straight. I only escaped because I went into the water and let myself float downriver into areas I wasn't planning to go. A person chased you, I said. Not a thing. A person who was probably also a researcher or a lost hiker or... No, David interrupted. It wasn't a person. It had human form, but it wasn't human. It ran in ways no human could run. It moved through the forest at night, without any light source, any noise. It was tracking me the way a predator tracks prey. And when I finally managed to escape, when I was delirious and half dead from fear and exhaustion, that's when it changed. Changed how? I asked against my better judgment. Into something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that wasn't bound by the normal rules of biology. I saw it for just a moment, in the darkness, and the image is burned into my mind forever. I see it every time I close my eyes. I realized then that I was dealing with someone who had experienced severe trauma. Whether the trauma was real or imagined didn't matter. The psychological damage was genuine. David, I can help you. Let me take you back to the cabin. We can radio for medical support. You can get proper psychiatric care. Psychiatric care? David's laugh was harsh. There's no care for what I have. I'm marked now. It marked me when it hunted me. And it will keep marking others until someone figures out what it is and how to stop it. We talked for another hour. David told me more about his experiences, his beliefs, his conviction that something dangerous was living in these woods. He talked about Native American folklore, about skinwalker legends, about the stories that the indigenous peoples had told for generations about creatures that could change form, that hunted humans, that were fundamentally wrong in ways that defied explanation. I tried to present counter-arguments. I tried to explain psychological phenomenon like trauma-induced hallucinations and PTSD, but David seemed unmoved by logic or reason. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and David agreed to rest in my camp. I gave him food and water, which he consumed eagerly as if he hadn't eaten in days, which, given his condition, was probably true. I kept watch that night, sitting with my pistol within reach, though I wasn't sure what I would do if the situation became dangerous. I didn't believe David was an immediate threat to me. He seemed more scared than aggressive, but he was clearly disturbed, and I was uncertain what his next move would be. By morning, David was gone. I woke to find him missing from the camp, and there was no sign of where he had gone or in which direction he had traveled. I called out for him several times, but there was no response. I should have left then. I should have packed up my camp, returned to the cabin, and reported the encounter to the ranger service. David was clearly a person in crisis, and he should have been found and given proper medical care. But I didn't leave. Instead, I rationalized it to myself. David was a ranger, or had been. He had survival skills. He didn't want help. Forcing the issue would likely make things worse. I would continue my work, and if I encountered him again, I would handle it differently. This was a mistake. The encounter with David changed my understanding of the situation, though not in the way it should have. Instead of being a warning to leave the wilderness and report what I had seen, it reinforced my belief that something unusual was actually happening in these woods. David had been looking for evidence of something anomalous, just as I was. The fact that he had become mentally unstable suggested to me that he had encountered something that had caused psychological trauma. But I interpreted this as evidence that there was something real to find, not as a warning that pursuing this knowledge was dangerous. I continued my research with renewed intensity. I moved my base camp deeper into the wilderness, to an area called the Western Ridge, where I had documented several sets of large tracks. I set up multiple trail cameras. I began recording audio more frequently. I marked potential den sites that I planned to observe. Over the course of December and into early January, I accumulated what I believed to be compelling evidence. Audio recordings of deep vocalizations that didn't match any known animal. I had 3 separate recordings, captured across different locations and different dates. The sounds were consistent in tone and structure, suggesting they came from the same species. Hair samples collected from barbed wire I had strung across trails. The samples were long, dark, and coarse, different from bear hair or deer hair. I carefully preserved them in sealed containers, planning to have them analyzed by a lab once I had gotten off the mountain. Large footprints, documented photographically and measured. I had found 8 distinct sets, all with the same morphological characteristics, 15 to 17 inches long, bipedal, with the distinctive mid-tarsal break. And then in mid-January, I found something that seemed like definitive proof. A partially consumed deer carcass, positioned in a way that suggested it had been killed and cached by an intelligent predator. The remains showed evidence of careful butchering, not the random tearing apart you would see from a normal predator. This was a kill made by something that understood anatomy, that knew how to efficiently process meat. I documented it all. I photographed it from every angle, I recorded notes on my audio device, and I made the decision to stake out the location, wait to see if the predator would return to feed on the cached carcass. This decision would lead directly to the night that changed everything. I established my observation point about 200 yards from the kill site in a location with good sight lines and cover. I had packed supplies for a 5-day stakeout: food, water, a sleeping bag, my camera equipment, and my pistol. The temperature was dropping as we moved deeper into winter. The nights were getting down to -5 or -10 Fahrenheit. Staying motionless for extended periods was dangerous. Hypothermia could set in quickly if I wasn't careful. But I had prepared for this. I had proper cold weather gear, a sleeping bag rated for extreme temperatures, and the ability to move around occasionally to maintain circulation. The first 3 days were uneventful. Nothing approached the kill site. I saw a deer passing through the area, and once I thought I saw a large shape moving through the forest, but when I looked through my binoculars, I couldn't identify it clearly. On the 4th night, something changed. I was sitting in the darkness, my night vision goggles providing a greenish view of the landscape, when I heard it. A sound, distinct and clear, something walking through the forest, moving toward the kill site. The footfalls were heavy, suggesting a large animal, but the pattern was wrong. It wasn't the 4-legged gait of a bear or a moose. It was bipedal. I had my camera ready, my telephoto lens equipped with a flash attachment. I was trembling with anticipation. If the creature came close enough, if I could get a photograph or video, it would be the most important discovery in cryptozoology history. The creature emerged into the clearing where the kill was located. I have replayed the next 10 seconds in my mind thousands of times since that night, trying to make sense of what I saw. The creature was approximately 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur. Its proportions were ape-like, with long arms and a stocky torso. Its face, even in the green glow of my night vision goggles, seemed flattened with a pronounced brow ridge. It moved with a strange, fluid grace, almost like it was gliding rather than walking. For a moment I was absolutely certain I was looking at a real Bigfoot. Everything I had theorized, everything I had researched, everything I had hoped to find was standing 30 yards in front of me. I raised my camera and pressed the shutter. The flash went off. The creature's head snapped toward me immediately. For the first time, I was looking directly at its face, illuminated by my camera flash. And in that moment of clarity, something shifted in my perception. The creature's face was wrong. Not wrong in the way an ape's face is different from a human's, wrong in a way that was harder to articulate. The features seemed to shift slightly, as if they weren't quite settled in their final configuration. The eyes, and this is difficult to explain, the eyes didn't reflect light the way animal eyes reflect light. There was something wrong about the entire structure. And then the creature moved. It moved with such explosive speed that I barely registered the motion. One moment it was standing in the clearing, perhaps 30 yards away. The next moment it was at my observation point, having crossed the distance in what might have been 2 seconds. I reacted on pure instinct. I scrambled backward, still in my observation position, but now trying to get away from the creature. My night vision goggles came off in my panic, and I was suddenly in complete darkness, trying to process what I had just seen. The creature's vocalization, a deep resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through my chest, came from where my observation point had been. It was searching for me, I realized. It was hunting me. I ran. The next several minutes were a blur of desperate flight through a dark forest. Branches tore at my face. I fell twice, scrambling back to my feet immediately. Behind me, I could hear the creature moving, and it was fast. Impossibly fast. Much faster than I should be able to run, which meant it was closing the distance. I had my pistol. I could have stopped, turned, and fired. The .357 Magnum would almost certainly hit a large target at close range. But the moment I saw the creature's face, that wrong, shifting face, I understood that shooting it might be ineffective. Or it might do something worse. It might make it angry. I ran toward the creek I knew was south of my position, toward water and the possibility of losing my pursuit. The creature was still behind me. I could hear it, feel its presence like a physical force at my back. The vocalizations were getting closer, and they seemed to contain an intelligence, a malevolence that no animal should be capable of expressing. I reached the creek and plunged into the freezing water without hesitation. The cold was a shock that nearly made me lose consciousness, but it also focused my mind. I was flowing downstream, the water carrying me rapidly away from where I had entered. The creature appeared on the bank, silhouetted against the slightly lighter darkness of the night sky. It stood there, watching me drift away, its massive head tracking my progress downstream. And then it opened its mouth and made a sound that still haunts my nightmares. Not an animal sound, but something that almost resembled human speech. Distorted, inhuman, but unmistakably language of some kind. Then it was gone, dissolved back into the darkness of the forest. I don't know how long I floated downstream. I was hypothermic, barely conscious, my survival instincts operating on autopilot. Eventually, I managed to drag myself onto a muddy bank, and I lay there, shaking uncontrollably, for what might have been hours or might have been minutes. When dawn came, I was able to assess my situation. I was approximately 5 miles downstream from my observation point, in terrain I didn't recognize. I had lost my camera, most of my supplies were gone, and I was severely hypothermic. My clothes were soaked, my body was shutting down, and I knew that if I didn't get to shelter and warmth very soon, I would die. I began the trek back toward the cabin. It took me 2 days to reach the ranger cabin. I was delirious for most of the journey, my hypothermia so severe that I was barely able to function. I fell multiple times. I got lost several times. But something, call it survival instinct, call it desperation, kept me moving forward. When I finally reached the cabin, I collapsed on the porch. I woke several hours later, inside, with no memory of how I had gotten into the building. But I had managed to start a fire, and the warmth was beginning to bring me back to consciousness. I spent the next 3 days in a fever-induced haze, my body fighting off the exposure and whatever illness had accompanied my hypothermia. I drank water constantly. I forced myself to eat. And I tried to make sense of what had happened. What had I actually encountered? The logical explanation was that I had seen a bear, a large black bear, or possibly a grizzly, that had wandered into this region. My night vision goggles, combined with my expectation of seeing a Bigfoot, had caused me to misidentify a normal animal as something unusual. The subsequent panic and hypothermia had altered my perceptions further, creating a false memory of something anomalous. This was the explanation that made the most sense. But I knew it wasn't true. What I had seen was not a bear. The biomechanics were wrong. The speed was wrong. The intelligence was wrong. And most of all, that face, that wrong shifting face, was not anything that could be rationalized as a normal animal. On the 4th day, when I was finally able to function coherently, I realized I needed to make a decision. Report what had happened or keep quiet. If I reported the encounter, I would be admitting that I had gone into the wilderness during winter, had gotten myself into a life-threatening situation, and had come back with a story that sounded completely delusional. At best, I would lose my job and be dismissed as mentally unstable. At worst, I would be committed for psychiatric evaluation. But if I kept quiet, I would be allowing this thing, whatever it was, to continue existing in the wilderness, potentially dangerous to anyone else who might encounter it. I thought about David Orinoco. He had kept quiet. He had lived in the wilderness for 4 years, trying to contain or understand the thing that had hunted him. Was I becoming like him? Was I destined to spend the rest of my life in paranoia and obsession, trying to solve a mystery that should have driven me away? I made my decision. I would report what I had experienced, but I would present it in a way that made it seem less impossible. I would claim that I had encountered a large bear, an unidentified specimen that had unusual coloration and behavioral patterns. I would say that the bear had attacked me, I had gotten into the creek, and I had made it back to safety. I would ask the Ranger Service to send a team to investigate the kill site I had documented, but I wouldn't mention the speed, I wouldn't mention the face, I wouldn't mention the vocalizations that sounded almost like language. On the 5th day of my recovery, I radioed the Ranger Service and reported that I had been attacked by a large bear and that I needed immediate assistance and medical evaluation. A rescue team arrived the next day by helicopter. They transported me to a hospital in Juneau, where I underwent a full medical evaluation. The doctors found me severely dehydrated, malnourished, and showing signs of cold exposure. They treated my wounds and prescribed medication for the bacterial infection that had developed in one of the gashes on my leg. But physically, I was going to be okay. Psychologically was another matter. The Ranger Service launched an investigation into the incident. A team was sent to the area where I said I had been attacked. They found my observation camp. They found the trail camera I had set up. And they found the kill site, the partially consumed deer carcass. What they found was consistent with bear behavior, according to the official report. The deer had been killed and partially cached by a large predator, and everything about the scene was consistent with a grizzly, or an unusually large black bear. They found hair samples near the site that were being analyzed by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, but they didn't find the creature itself. There was significant discussion about the trail camera footage. I had left it running, and there might be video of whatever had approached the kill site. But when the team recovered the camera, the memory card was corrupted. There was no video footage, no images, nothing. It was as if whatever had approached that kill site had specifically targeted the camera and rendered it inoperable. But that was impossible. A bear couldn't have known what the camera was or how to destroy it. The Ranger Service offered me the option to return to my post after I had recovered, or to take a transfer to another location. I chose the transfer. I couldn't go back to the Kootznoowoo. The thought of returning to that wilderness, of potentially encountering that thing again, was more than I could face. I was reassigned to a ranger station in Oregon, about as far from Alaska as I could get within the Ranger Service. I spent the next several months doing routine administrative work, trying to rebuild my life and forget what I had experienced. But I couldn't forget. It took me months before I started researching seriously. During my time in Oregon, I began systematically investigating David Orinoco's claims. I wanted to understand what I had encountered. I wanted to know if there were other documented cases of similar creatures or incidents. What I found was disturbing. There were, in fact, quite a few reports of unusual creatures in remote areas of the United States. Most were easily dismissed hoaxes, misidentifications, or the testimony of unreliable witnesses. But a few were harder to explain away. In particular, I found a significant body of research on Native American folklore regarding creatures that could change form or that possessed anomalous properties. The Navajo skinwalker folklore was well documented, but what I hadn't realized was that similar beliefs existed in many indigenous cultures across North America, the Pacific Northwest tribes included. I found references to creatures that the Tlingit and Haida peoples had understood as existing in the deep forests. The descriptions varied, but many of them matched what I had seen. Bipedal, tall, wrong in some fundamental way, dangerous to humans. I also researched documented cases of cryptid sightings in Alaska, specifically, and I found something that interested me greatly. A reference to a research team from the University of Alaska that had been studying bear behavior in southeast Alaska in 2016. One of the researchers, David Orinoco, had withdrawn from the project with no explanation and had disappeared into the wilderness. The university had filed a missing persons report, but David had never been found. As far as official records were concerned, he was presumed dead, likely killed by wildlife or exposure. I also found a reference to a ranger who had been reassigned from the Kootznoowoo station in 2015 for reasons that were never fully explained. The official report said he had requested a transfer due to personal reasons, but I found a comment in an online forum from someone claiming to be familiar with the situation, saying that the ranger had experienced something traumatic that had not been reported to the public. Were these connected? Was the ranger from 2015 encountering the same thing that David had encountered, that I had encountered? And if there was a pattern, how many people had encountered this thing over the years? How many had survived? How many had gone mad? I began reaching out to retired rangers who had worked in southeast Alaska. Most didn't respond to my inquiries, but one did. A man named Robert Kim, who had worked in the region from 1998 to 2005. I called him, and I asked him directly about unusual incidents during his tenure. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What have you encountered?" he asked, his voice careful and guarded. I told him my story. I explained what I had seen, what I was trying to understand. "You're lucky," he said finally. "Very lucky. Most people don't survive an encounter. Most people don't escape." "What did you encounter?" I asked. "I can't talk about it," Robert said. "Not over the phone, not in writing. But I will tell you this, whatever you saw, whatever you think you saw, it's real. It exists. And the best thing you can do is pretend you never saw it, and never go back to that place. But I need to understand, I started. No, you don't, Robert interrupted. Understanding makes it worse. Obsession makes it worse. Belief in it, even rational belief, even scientific belief, all of that makes it worse. The only way to survive an encounter with that thing is to forget about it and move on with your life. But I couldn't do that. Over the next 2 years, I became obsessed with finding more information. I traveled to Alaska multiple times, visiting small towns and talking to people who had lived in remote areas. I conducted interviews with indigenous guides and hunters who knew the wilderness. I attended conferences on cryptozoology and folklore. I read everything I could find about unsolved disappearances in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. What emerged from this research was a pattern. There were disappearances. Not frequent, but regular. A hiker here, a researcher there, a backpacker who never returned from a trip. Most were attributed to bears, or exposure, or accidents. But some had notes attached reports from friends or family members that the person had mentioned encountering something unusual, something that didn't fit normal animal behavior. I found that indigenous peoples across the Pacific Northwest had knowledge of something in the deep forests. The descriptions varied based on the specific culture and tradition, but the core was consistent. An entity that possessed intelligence, that could move and hunt with terrifying efficiency, that was not bound by normal biological or behavioral rules. Most importantly, I found that this entity was solitary or paired. It didn't exist in groups. It seemed to be territorial, occupying specific regions of the wilderness and maintaining that territory over extended periods. And I found something else. A reference in a 1954 newspaper article from a small Alaskan town. The article reported on a feral man who had been living in the wilderness and had been spotted several times near civilization before disappearing. Witnesses described him as mentally unstable and dangerous. The article speculated that he might have been the victim of a tragic accident or might have committed suicide. But one comment, buried in a follow-up article from a month later, caught my attention. A native guide was quoted as saying, "That wasn't a feral man, that was someone who had encountered the skin. He was marked. Once you're marked, you can never go back to being fully human." Marked. The same word David had used. I began to understand the shape of this mystery. Whatever existed in the deep forests of Alaska and the Pacific Northwest was not a simple, undocumented animal. It was something more complex. Something that could exist alongside human civilization without being documented or proven to exist. Something that left survivors who were traumatized, marked, changed in fundamental ways. And I understood something else. David Orinoco had become obsessed with this creature, just as I had. He had spent years in the wilderness, trying to understand it, trying to contain it, trying to warn others about it, and in doing so, he had become something other than fully human. Was I on the same path? I am writing this account now, 3 years after my encounter, sitting in an apartment in Portland, Oregon. I have stepped back from my obsession. I have not returned to the Kootznoowoo. I have not continued active research into the creature, but I have not forgotten. The knowledge that something real exists in those remote forests, something that cannot be easily explained or dismissed, remains with me. I have come to a conclusion that I did not want to reach. The thing I encountered was not a Bigfoot. It was not an undocumented primate species that could be studied scientifically and explained through evolutionary biology. It was something other. It was something that human culture and human history have attempted to explain through folklore and mythology for thousands of years. Different cultures had different names for it. The Navajo called it the skinwalker. The Pacific Northwest tribes had their own terminology. Modern cryptozoology called it the Bigfoot or Sasquatch. But the names were less important than the reality. There existed in the deep wilderness of North America a predatory entity that was intelligent, dangerous, and real. How many of them were there? I don't know. Based on the accounts I've researched, it seems like there were relatively few, perhaps one or two per major wilderness region. They were territorial. They were efficient hunters, and they had survived into the modern era by avoiding human detection and by possessing qualities that made them nearly impossible to capture, photograph, or prove scientifically. What was their origin? Were they a remnant species of hominid that had developed unusual adaptations or capabilities? Were they something else entirely? I have no answers. The evidence I had collected, the hair samples, the footprints, the recordings, had all been lost or corrupted or dismissed as inconclusive by the scientific community, and perhaps that was for the best? If the creature I encountered could be definitively proven to exist, if scientific evidence could be gathered and published, it would trigger a hunt. The military would get involved. Hunting expeditions would be organized. The creature's territory would be violated and disrupted. And based on what I had witnessed, based on what David had described, based on the accounts I had researched, the creatures would respond. People would be killed. Lots of them, probably. Because the creatures were efficient predators, and humans who tried to hunt them in their own territory would be at a severe disadvantage. Perhaps the universe had made a silent bargain. If humans did not capture definitive proof of these entities' existence, the entities would remain in the deep wilderness, largely avoiding populated areas and limiting their human kills. But if humans did capture proof, if humans did prove these creatures real, the bargain would break, and there would be a reckoning. I have decided not to pursue this further. David Orinoco warned me that pursuing knowledge of this thing is dangerous. Robert Kim told me to forget about it and move on. And I have tried to do exactly that. But I cannot unknow what I know. Whenever I see a news report about a missing hiker or a ranger gone missing in a remote area, I wonder. When I read about a cryptid sighting, I wonder if what someone reported might actually be real. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that vocalization, that deep, resonant sound that was almost like language, but not quite. That sound that contained an intelligence and a hunger that no animal should be capable of expressing. I do not know if the creature remembers me. I do not know if it is still in the Kootznoowoo or if it has moved on to other territories. I do not know if David Orinoco is still alive, still living in the wilderness, still trying to contain and understand the thing that hunted him. What I do know is this. There is something real in the deep forests of Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. It is dangerous, it is intelligent, and it has managed to hide from human knowledge despite countless encounters over many decades. I have decided to keep silent about what I experienced, and I urge anyone who reads this to understand that the silence is not denial, the silence is wisdom. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some knowledge is better left undiscovered, and some creatures are better left undisturbed in the wilderness where they belong. I received a message 2 months ago from an unknown sender. The message contained only the coordinates of a location in southeast Alaska and a single sentence: "He's coming back. Lock the doors." I deleted the message. I have not responded. I have not looked up the coordinates to see if they correspond to any location I recognize. I do not know who sent it. It could be David. It could be someone else who has encountered the creature. It could be a hoax or a threat. I have chosen to believe that it is a warning, and I have heeded that warning by staying away from Alaska and the Kootznoowoo wilderness. As for what I encountered in that clearing so many years ago, I will spend the rest of my life wondering if what I saw was real, or if my mind constructed it from fear, expectation, and the strangeness of the wilderness at night. But I know the truth, and I carry that knowledge with me every day. They have a